Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. I'm Steve Gibson.
I'm Ben Matlock.
And we're here.
Goodbye.
Yeah. That's kind of how that's my whole mood this week is.
That's a very matter-of-fact intro to the show. I'm Steve Gibson. I'm Ben Matlock. We were here and now it's over.
You can't tell us we didn't do our job. We just did it to the bare minimum.
Yeah, technically it was a show this week, and what a show it was.
Our bosses will be we're talking like this is an actual job and when we have bosses, but
yeah, not something like hey, we're the lucky ones because we already had a show to do before all this quarantine shit started, so we at least have one point in the week where we get to pretend to be busy.
Right.
But if you haven't listened to the Non-Essential Podcast before, every week, me and Steve get together and tell each other stories. A lot of times they're, stories grounded in history, but there's really not a limitation to it. We talk about whatever the fuck seems interesting. And the only criteria is the other person doesn't know what we're bringing.
Right.
And it's my turn this week, so...
Thank God, too, because... If it was, I'm so mentally burned out. If it was my turn, I'd be like, yeah.
Talk about what you ordered for lunch.
It was a sandwich.
In excruciating detail.
The first bite, you got the texture of the lettuce and Pretty much.
About halfway through, I just caved to animalistic hunger, and I couldn't even taste it anymore. I was just shoveling it in.
That's pretty spot on, actually. But
yeah. So this week, this is a weird one because we've talked about a lot of evil fucking shit, and this show has touched on really dark subject matter before, and I think this is maybe the darkest well I've gone down, and it won't seem like that based off the topic itself, but to get the information I got for it,
you went undercover
I had to do some shit I'm not proud of, okay? But we'll get to it. So Franz Reichelt was born in Wegstottel, which is a name of a place with way too many consonants crammed together.
I know. I was just about to laugh and say you took the Steve route, and the first 5 words out of them have 837.
Yeah, GST and DTL shouldn't go together in fucking anything. But that's what we got. It was in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which was part of the then Austro-Hungarian Empire, which isn't a thing anymore. Now it's the Czech Republic.
Of course. Yeah, I think we're all pretty familiar with.
Yeah, but it was 1878. And unlike a lot of people I've talked about on this show, not much is really known about his upbringing or his family life. But by 1898, he moved to Paris and became a French citizen by 1909.
It's interesting to me how many of these people we've come across that, the biography is basically, there's nothing noteworthy until they move to Paris.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, because Paris is when shit goes down.
Yeah.
It really is the international Vegas. So he moved to Paris and he changed his professional name from Franz to Francois. He was unmarried, but he seemed to be living a pretty stable life in Paris. He found a nice apartment, and he opened a successful dressmaking business that proved to be especially popular for Austrian tourists. But Franz had his ambitions set on invention, as the modern world was rapidly building upon the idea of powered flight. At this point, the Wright brothers had conducted their first flight in 1903, and over the years, more and more experiments had been conducted. Some with tragic consequences, such as the death of Thomas Selfridge, who would die in the first powered plane crash in 1908.
I don't know, though. If you're going to die in a powered plane crash, be at least the first one to do it. The very first,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of gets all condensed. You start with the Wright brothers, and then we kind of, in history, we just jump to and then we were flying, but
right.
But there is, and today's story is touching on that. There was like 10 years of like figuring this shit out. And more than 10 years, but this was in the heart of that first decade of learning, like, how can we get people to fly? Which is, you know, if I were alive at that time, I'd be like, you don't, because that's a silly idea. But, you know, these are much braver people than I am.
Well, you got to consider, as bad as things can be around here, like politically and social, you know, whatever, back then it was worse. So I don't blame them for looking for every chance as possible to like get off the earth. Like,
yeah, we really are just like a few more months into a quarantine from building our own rocket ships in our barns.
Like, you're probably going to die. You're like, it's worth it.
Yeah. So I don't know if it was the Thomas Selfridge incident itself that motivated Reichelt, but it was in this time that he became fixated on how to protect these, you know, pioneers of safety or pioneers of flight. And he became convinced that it was his calling to construct something that would radically improve their chances of surviving if their planes failed on them. So at this point, parachutes weren't like, he wasn't inventing the first parachute. They go back centuries. And in fact, the original design, canopy sort of design of parachutes is something that we roughly use to this day. But by Franz's time, the canopy was like fixed on a rigid frame that you couldn't, like, you had to have it open all the time. Like, parachutes were something that you jumped from a tall height.
Yeah,
and
like,
it was something
people don't
already
realize
open.
that base jumping was actually predated parachuting.
Yeah, you know, it was more akin to like those, like, you know, gliders we have today or something.
I was thinking Mary Poppins, but yeah.
Yeah, you know. Well, yeah, an umbrella for a Titan. So obviously it was not something you could shove into a plane cockpit. The idea of a parachute is, if my dog would just let us do the show one fucking week, I swear to God. Just the worst. The idea of a parachute is that you expand the surface area of a falling person so that their descent slows. And Franz took the approach of integrating that expanding surface area into the suit itself so that pilots would have a survival option if their planes failed on them. So the initial appeal to Franz's design was that it was supposed to be a lightweight sort of thing and it wouldn't hinder movement. You know, sorry, you had something?
No, I was just, the whole time I'm sitting here picturing, so he invented MC Hammer, like the parachute pants.
Funny you should say that. Like, we'll have sources this week, and there are photos of him, and he is wearing some puffy shit, for sure. So think like a puffier, slightly more awkward version of like wingsuits that we have today. Think about that and then forget about it entirely, because even with refinements, Franz's suit was heavy and awkward as shit. It weighed a ton and was made out of a ton of material, but he was experimenting with his design by the summer of 1910. He made a weighted dummy and he would throw it from the 5th floor of his building to the ground. And supposedly these early tests were successful, and the dummy gently sort of glided to the ground without much damage.
Did he make his weighted dummy out of interns?
Hey, are you good? Yeah, just don't throw me out again. But as he tested it, you know, because the suit was heavy, it wasn't something you could practically put on a pilot. He had to keep refining it. And as he tested it and refined it more, dummies seemed to crash violently down into the courtyard in what certainly would have been a fatal impact for any real person. Nevertheless, Franz was convinced that he was on the right path and even presented the idea to the leading aviation organization at the time, the Aero Club de France. De France. I mean, you got it. It's a name. You got it. So he presented his idea to them, despite the fact that it's basically been failing every test he had been running for it. But he was sure it was the right idea. And they kind of told him pretty bluntly, the surface of your device is too weak. You'll break your neck. Like, you can't, this won't work. So he still had work to do. Eventually, he was able to bring the weight of the suit down to 25 kilograms from the 70 kilograms of the initial design.
That's pretty good. That's almost a third, yeah.
Yeah, and he doubled the surface area of the material somehow. But the dummies kept getting fucked up with every test. So at a certain point, you have to say the design is fundamentally flawed and you have to try a new approach. Or you decide it's just time for human trials, because that's what Franz did.
I was just about to say, you decide, well, the problem's obviously the dummies and not the suit.
Right. So by 1911, he began testing the suit himself. One notable test came when he jumped out of a window over 26 feet off the ground and broke his leg. Franz remained convinced that his suit would work. And that the only problem was that the drop distance was too short for the flaps to deploy properly. So maybe, just maybe, his suit was working perfectly fine and it was gravity that was broken. Take that.
Well, in fairness, that was the first thing I was going to say, because I'm no, base jumping, parachuting expert, but in my mind, I'm picturing it 26 feet doesn't, like even a good modern parachute, I don't think would do much over 26 feet.
Sure, but but you could also the parachute is trying to catch the air. His thing was just not like deploying in time.
Yeah, and it takes some guts to be like, well, I'm pretty sure the problem is, even though I broke my legs, I didn't jump from high enough. So I assume he tries again.
Oh yeah, boy does he. By this point, the Aero Club had offered a reward to anybody who could develop a superior parachute design, for something that could help kind of these early aviator people. Despite the fact that they had already told Franz that he had not, in fact, done this feat, he was convinced he had and set out to prove it with a demonstration from the first deck of the Eiffel Tower. This would be over 180 feet in the air. Authorities weren't about to let somebody just leap off the fucking Eiffel Tower, though, to test some experimental parachute. But Franz was able to get permission by claiming that he was just going to be using a mannequin for the demonstration, and that he wasn't going to himself be jumping in the suit.
Well, the funny part is, I would imagine that the Aero Club de France would have probably accepted a test with a mannequin.
Yeah, well, they didn't need a test. They looked at his design and they're like, it's not safe.
Well, yeah.
Like, you're just wearing puffy clothes. You might as well just wrap yourself up in pillows. I know the landing.
It's like, no, I already tried that one. Those tests didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. So he told him that he wouldn't be jumping, and it was total bullshit. He had every intention of making the jump himself. He showed up to the tower on Sunday, February 4th, 1912. It was a chilly day, and Reichelt he showed up already wearing the parachute suit, and he was just kind of, it was all under the guise of like, oh, I'm just showing it off how it's, supposed to look on people. And there was 30-something members of press who came to this demonstration, so it was all just under the guise of like, no, I'm just showing it to the press how it's supposed to work. Franz wandered around the site, inspecting all the arrangements of this experiment, being diligent, covering his bases in case of any mishap. And then before he ascended the tower, he told the onlookers, "See you soon," and climbed up, kind of to the shock of city authorities, it was him himself who stepped out onto the ledge in the suit.
That's not a mannequin.
Wait a minute. But Franz was convinced that for some reason this test would only work with a human. And he said it was due to the height and the weight of his body that the suit would function correctly. So
well, wait. So even if his test worked, he's saying that only a pilot that's exactly as tall and heavy as him can use the suit.
it was at this point in the story that I'm like, you know what? I don't think he actually had much scientific thought behind this reasoning. Because you got to remember, like, that, even if the initial experiments did work, which we only kind of have his word that they did, like, the last 2 years were just experiment after experiment of failure, you know? Like, at this point, his design was fundamentally just not working, and it's like...
Well, you know, and the scientific mind would look at this and say, well, obviously the problem is it worked fine when there was no other observers, but when somebody else was watching, it doesn't work. So obviously, audience is what causes his...
I've long been pushing the theory in the scientific community that humans can fly if no one's watching.
Exactly.
But nobody will take me up on that and give me $1 million. So, yeah, it's, 2 years of failure, but here we are now with Franz Reichelt at the fucking Eiffel Tower and 180 feet off the ground. And he had a few friends with him that climbed up to the tower to kind of help him prepare. And as he stood on the ledge, they begged him to call it off. One, like the heavy wind and the cold air, even if you were confident in your design, you would be a little bit worried about the weather. And they're like, even if you don't call it off, just use a dummy once. Like, just see what happens with the dummy before you fucking jump off. Franz Reichelt's resolve would not waver.
Hero.
So he stood on the ledge for an agonizing 40 seconds. And then, he doesn't jump. He kind of... he's on this platform and he doesn't jump or there's no form to it. He kind of just rolls off the platform. And it was obvious immediately to anyone watching that it was just fucked. His suit didn't deploy and all the material just seemed to wrap around and tangle him up. And he plummeted to the frozen ground in seconds and died on impact.
Shocking. I really had my money on it working this time.
Yeah. So the reason this was kind of a fucked up one for me this week is there's a recorded video of this whole thing.
Oh, nice.
And even in early kind of grainy 1900s film, it is fucking really disturbing to watch because you're literally watching a man die. So when you go through the sources this week, don't click that link.
I'm looking it up right now, but...
it's just a fuck thing. It's unbearable how long he stands on that platform, and it's just, ugh.
Yeah, because I see the video. I haven't clicked it because I really kind of don't want to watch it.
Yeah, you don't need that shit in your life.
So that tells you, though, that if he stood up there, he went out and stood up there that long, it's it was the realization to him that this is this stupid idea and it's not going to work. Yeah. And then he talked himself into doing it anyway.
Yeah. So Reichelt's story is kind of held up in that Darwin's Award thing where people kind of, get laughs off of dumb people dying for doing dumb shit. And, it's far be it for me to give those people shit because that's, part of the identity of this show, I guess, is I'm doing it now. I'm kind of mocking a guy for his failure. But even in this case, it's not even necessarily direct stupidity from Franz. For all I know, he could have put together a great design if he kept working at it. I think the fundamental flaw in what happened was that he came up with this initial design and became too prideful and invested in it to admit that it wasn't going to work. Maybe there were some ideas in it, but he never totally made that transition. He was just if I just make it lighter and cover more area, then it'll be fine, despite the fact that it keeps failing.
That's the thing that gets me and I think I could probably sit here and come up with a list of people I know that would probably fall into the same, I'm the opposite. I'm the pessimist. If it doesn't work on the first try, it's well, that was a waste of my time. Why try to make it better? But that just are convinced this is going to work. You can't tell me otherwise. And it's mind-boggling that every test he did failed, but he was still so convinced that he was right that he was willing to jump off of the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at some of the great inventions, and there's, years of trial and error behind a lot of them. His issue was, he was convinced that, they were successes and that it was time to take it to, the Eiffel Tower with a human in the suit. When it's you should be throwing dummies off the Eiffel Tower for another year before you try to jump out of it, at least. So, I genuinely get the vibe when he climbed the tower that day that the worst thing in his mind was that he would throw a dummy off the roof and it wouldn't work. Because I think at this point he had put years of his life into this fucking suit. So
yeah,
I truly...
You're your biggest fear is not dying until you step up on that ledge. I guarantee that's why he... Yeah, but it's really, they're so desperate to not have wasted all that time and money and resources that...
Yeah. So I truly think, and maybe it's just dramatizing it in my head because I fucking watched the video, but I truly think he was at a point where it's this fucker will work, or I'd rather be fucking dead than face the fact that it's, this thing I slaved over is a busted piece of shit. So maybe Franz was dumb, but really I think this is kind of just a story of dangerous pride and investment.
Yeah, and desperation maybe. And...
Yeah, because it's at that time, you get sucked in to this community that's we're trying to create safe modern plane travel. And he wanted to be in on that and be important in it. And everything he had done up to that point had been a failure. But this is a Ben topic on the Non-Essential Podcast. So, we got one more footnote just to give Franz one more good kick in the nuts before we wrap up. So news traveled slower back then, but if he had just waited a while, Franz Reichelt would have learned that 2 days before he fell to his death, an American parachute inventor by the name of Frederick R. Law successfully jumped from the Statue of Liberty with a wearable parachute. So
it was completely in vain because it had already been...
Yeah, so even if it fucking worked, he probably wouldn't get the reward money, and his design would probably be worse, because, again, it failed for 2 years.
Now, that said, from the sounds of it, and because I'm such a good human, behavior analysis, whatever, I don't even know the correct term, that's how good I am.
Whatever it is, you're awesome at it.
I can almost guarantee, even had he received the news of that test, he would have still jumped to do his, because
maybe but without the onlookers.
Well, yeah, that's true. I don't know though. Well, yeah, especially because you lied and said it was going to be a dummy. So then, because if you tell the truth and say you're going to do it, you're always going to get onlookers because people are going to watch for.
Well, if he said he was going to do it, the authorities wouldn't have let him do it.
Yeah,
they would have told him no. So.
Which shows us something, too, that the Paris authorities were smarter than the American authorities were probably that guy. They're like, yeah, jump all you want. Will your wife clean you up if you splat? Okay, cool.
Well, we don't know the history of that wearable parachute. Maybe his test worked for 2 years. Oh, yeah. And they're like, oh, yeah, of course we'll let him jump. It clearly works. But that was just the most appropriate, Of course the fucking thing this guy slaved over, died for, that is totally my shit when it comes to bringing something to this show.
Though, what's funny is as a society, we obviously know way more about parachuting and just all of that stuff now than we did back then. Yeah. But as an individual, I probably know the exact same amount about it as he did back then, probably less. Oh, yeah. Yet I do still feel like I could make a working parachute if you asked me to. I wouldn't want to be the guinea pig.
I feel like that's going to be your quarantine project.
But my point and part of it is we can cheat because we at least know the design, what a modern parachute looks like. And then, of course, we'd get it, as lay people, you'd get it completely fucking wrong because there is a lot of intricate things that go into it to keep it from tangling on deployment, that kind of thing. But in general, I feel like, I could make a mushroom-shaped piece of fabric that'll slow you down. And then you jump out and, like, the fabric rips because you don't realize the forces that are being put on it, or it doesn't deploy because you don't realize
the scary thing about being in that field of trying to innovate on parachutes is, like, all that shit is down on paper. Like, the moment you fucking actually have to jump with that shit, and you're just like, God damn, I hope this idea works. It's like the scariest thing ever. Yeah,
especially then, because now if you were trying to, like, say now we're trying to invent a new kind of parachute. I say maybe this one's more efficient or it's smaller or lighter. Well, you jump with a working parachute as a backup. But back then it was like there was no such thing as the backup. It was just you jumped.
Yeah, and I mean, you're totally right. Like, that's the thing. It was a new kind of field developing. And it's crazy in the grand timeline of just how quickly, like, mechanical plane flight took off in the grand scheme of things. But there was a ton of, failure and stuff and people trying to figure this out. And I'm sure this is just one story of one guy who was trying to get in on it. But I'm sure there's, a plethora of people who didn't know what they were doing, but wanted to fucking figure it out. And there was probably plenty of, failures, but, because
there's really only one way for these things to fail. Like,
yeah. Well, I learned in elementary school, you tie a little parachute to an egg and you throw it off the roof. And if that parachute works, you gradually work up.
Well, that's the funny part too, because even if you were, like you said, it doesn't sound like there was a ton of scientific expertise behind this guy's inventions and experiments. But even if there was, like, you do the math and you're like, okay, so if this parachute that was, we'll say, 8 inches by 8 inches was enough to slow the egg down, well, we'll scale it up. What do I weigh compared to the egg? Okay, well, now I need a parachute that's like 3.5 miles by 3.5. Well, shit, that's not going to work. It's complicated math, and it doesn't necessarily just scale up from small stuff. But
it is. It's just a funny progression, I think, of, like, the guy he probably just, like, roughed it out in his head, where he's like, he was a tailor, so he was just like, all this material, this is how much material we need for this thing to stay alive. And then it's like, that's way too much material. So just, like, as the experiments get worse and worse, he's just cutting down the design more and more and, like, trying to make it more feasible, but also it's just like, it's not going to work at that point. So yeah,
but it is kind of spectacular that literally every test, it sounds like, leading, and my guess is that the ones that he says didn't work as well as he claimed they did. So it's like failure, failed test, failed test, failed test. But the only logical conclusion is to jump.
Right, but, like, even as you pointed out, like, even if those initial tests did work, it was with a suit that was like 3 times the size of, like, what he was working with by the end. You know
what? I'm looking at, and this is actually a still of right before he jumped off the ledge. That suit still isn't very practical or wearable by a pilot.
Nope. It's a very weird, it's weird. There's photos of him walking around with with the suit on, and it's not all that material. So when he gets up there with it, I don't know if he, like, already, like, pre-deployed it or whatever, which, like, might make sense, because if you're falling from a plane, you would have had it deployed before that point anyway. But you think you would want to, like, test the mechanism and shit too. Then again, I guess if you were going to put a dummy in it, you wouldn't be able to have it, like, pull a string or some shit.
Yeah.
Or for all I know, there wasn't a mechanism, and there was just this puffy suit, and then he attached, like, a fucking giant tarp to himself.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, one of these I was clicking through was an animated GIF of his death, so I did just see that. And
oh, good. I'm glad it's in GIF form.
Yeah.
Fucking internet.
And as bad, I mean, it's not like I've never seen videos of people die. I don't enjoy that. I know there's people out there that, like,
it's so
seek
fucking
out,
cool.
Yeah, seek out that stuff. I don't like, and who this guy kind of reminds me of is that, and I don't know his name offhand, but that flat earther inventor that was trying to make the steam powered rocket or something that just killed himself here within the last year or so. I think it was a couple months ago. And there's video of that because they were filming that test, and that one. You could say, well, that guy's stupid from the standpoint of he was a flat earther, but they had tests, and it was just it. Yeah. I mean, NASA's killed astronauts because something's gone wrong, and that's what happened in his case. And it's not fun to watch, but you see that stuff. But I will say, as much as I didn't particularly want to see that, and then it happened, it's not going to scar me because whatever. But when he hits the ground, it's very Looney Tunes-ish because there is a puff of smoke like dust.
That was such a great build up.
Yeah,
to being like, but to be fair,
it is kind of funny.
If he had landed with a bonk sound,
and it's zoomed out, but you do see
I get. There's no way to watch the video and not be uncomfortable with it. Yeah. I don't think,
because like you said, there is a human being there, and they died. And it's not graphic. You can't see blood and guts and stuff. But you know that's somebody's life coming to an end.
And in some ways that's worse because it's like you're really, it's fucking literally clear cut black and white, watching a man die. But I will say this for watching the video, there's something we do these stories all the time, and there is something kind of fascinating about actually seeing what the event play out, that they actually had footage of it, because we tell the story one way, and it if you just tell the timeline of it, it's tragic, but it's really funny.
Yeah, and it's really easy to not picture it as humans because it's a story, and a lot of these things that we talk about happened hundreds, 200s, 300s, sometimes 800 and 900 years ago. I mean, some of them are very old, and you're like, oh, it's it's in the past. And this one, this is over 100 years old, not much, but a little over 100 years old. Yeah. But that's just new enough that you can see it, and then it does put a real
it adds weight to it in a way that like I said, getting the material for the story by watching that video. This is probably the hardest one to put together because, like I said, the events are funny, but once you see the thing happening, that moment, that agonizingly long moment where he's on the ledge is so fucking hard to watch.
Yeah, and in fairness, the GIF doesn't show that full moment. It's just him rolling off the ledge, and but yeah, because he's up there, and you know that he's thinking, I'm probably going to die.
Yeah,
I don't care how confident he was. Because if I'm up there right now with a modern parachute that has got a 99.9% success rate, I'm still thinking I'm about to die. So he's testing this thing. He had to be. He had to have that thought in his head.
You put me on a first class plane flight seat. I'm sitting there like I'm about to die. I
will say his suit, for all the design and all the fabric, did not slow him down at all.
No, it's.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
It's a little amazing how fast it because you kind of picture, you said 142 feet or so is what that.
It was 180 feet.
180 feet. So you picture all this fall, and what's going through his mind. The fall takes a total of about a second and a half. It looks like maybe a little longer than that, but it's not like this. Oh, he's kind of slowing down, but he can tell it's not going to work. It would just be like you jump and you just yeah. Well, he didn't jump. He kind of just rolled.
He kind of tumbled. It's very weird. But that's the thing.
I bet you kind of wonder if he was just kind of having second thoughts and almost fainted off of it, because that's
what I mean is when you watch that video, you get in your head man, he is not confident in the design of this thing, but he's too far gone now.
It's interesting though. The one screen cap of this GIF, and you could probably find it as just a still image. there's obviously multiple video angles because this one's up on the ledge with him, so it's kind of from the side, and it's like I said, it's right before he rolls down, so he's kind of like crouched down and leaning forward a little bit. He looks like a Dark Souls villain that's about to fire, or maybe a Sekiro, one of those people. Like he's getting ready to swoop down on his victim. But I'm
like
really
one of those kite guys in Sekiro.
yeah. I was actually kind of giving me like flashbacks to like what is that, Lothric Castle or whatever. But those are where those Silver Knights don't dive bomb you; they just shoot you with big bows or whatever. But yeah, the kite guy, kind of a combination between the two because he's perched more like the knights, but
well, he definitely doesn't fly down at you like the kite guys.
I don't know. I bet he makes the same sounds because those come in with just like a. Ah!
Well, those guys are stoked about it. I don't.
Yeah, he was not stoked. At least that's not the body language.
The body language of somebody who's thrilled about his choices.
I would have kind of thought that if the suit didn't slow him down, that mustache would have. But
wouldn't that be remarkable? If like the mustache just flew him away, like his fucking. Like Iron Man's first flight, just like at the last minute, just fucking before he hits the ground, the fucking suit just propels him upward. Or the mustache.
We make jokes because if you don't, just the sheer tragedy and horribleness
like I said,
of it will win.
Yeah. Like I said, just having like that image of like what actually happened in my head now is very... Like, it's very weird. It's a very jarring...
Fortunately, we live on a time that you can just turn on the local news, and that whole mess will be worse than that, and you'll forget all about.
But I mean, like, it would be hypocritical to be like, "Oh, this is." I feel bad laughing about this story. It's like I laugh about fucking everything. It's how I deal with how horrible I see shit.
Yeah, exactly. I wasn't joking when I said that. That's a very real coping mechanism.
Yeah, so I mean, and
it does help that as tragic as this was, it was 100 years ago, so the guy would be dead now, right? Anyway, right?
So like, I'm glad that like I saw it in its kind of grim detail, because it helps me, it reminds you, it brings you back down to earth a little bit, and you're not like, I'm glad that I'm not desensitized to how fucking terrible it was. But it's also, a reminder of like, that's why I do the things I do. Like, that's why I laugh at the shit I laugh at. And that's why I do the topics I do on this show, is because it helps me, interpret that type of shit. So thanks, Non-Essential Podcast. Helping me understand myself 1 week at a time.
Yeah.
The end.
Oh, the humanity. Oh, that's the other tragedy that's coming up alongside this. It seems like there was a lot of horribly public deaths back in the early 1900s.
Yeah, they were.
Like, cameras and like televising stuff was just kind of first coming on the scene, and they hadn't learned like maybe you don't want to televise everything. Yeah,
that's what's funny though. Is like all these deaths in that time was like. That are caught, it's like, God, how'd they have 4 cameras set up for that already? Like, Jesus Christ, they were on the ball back then. Now we have to, like, use some bystander's fucking cell phone footage. Before it was like everyone was well lit and, like, properly angled and framed.
And then think of it this way. I came across that GIF, not really by accident, because I did specifically search them, but I wasn't really looking for the video of it. But back then, people would have seen that footage, but they would have had to gone to like a movie theater and sat and like specifically waited to see that.
That's what's fucked is like that would have been like played before like the main movie. Like today on Franz Reichelt.
The voice. I was just about to bust out that voice, but you do it better than me anyway.
Franz Reichelt's mustache carried him to the heavens.
Yeah. Oh no! You know what? If it was early 1900s, they might not have had the talkies yet. It would have
just been
into his death with like
Well, they would have somebody like reading it from the theater.
That's true. But I still like to think they would have put the piano over the actual footage, and then when he hits the ground, it would have just been like a bonk. Like they just...
Like a guy in the theater has two cymbals that he has to clang together.
Or maybe that's where that... what is it? Tuba or trombone, though. Wah, 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 wah. This is the video that started that.
Franz, if you can hear me wherever you are, I'm only laughing because I see you as a kindred spirit. Yeah.
I'm going to die and show up in hell, and Franz will be sitting there waiting for me like, guess who's your personal demon, asshole? And be like, crap.
Well, that's fine, if you're as good at torturing as you are at fucking making parachutes, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the show this week. Thank you all for listening, and hey, have a great week.